Howdy my totally tubular gamers, we're back with another video.
Well, it's time for another video on first-person shooters, and today we're going to be talking about some underrated FPS games. Now, there have been plenty, hundreds, dozens even, of FPS games throughout the years, and while plenty of them are very well known, you know, your Call of Duties, your Battlefields, your Halos, there are tons of games that flew under the radar that might actually be worth your time. And so today, we're going to be putting a spotlight on them. Today, we're going to be talking about 15 underrated first-person shooters that very well might be worth your time. This list is in no particular order, and it's from all generations of gaming. It's not just modern games or games from the 2000s, no. All years, and all sorts of FPS games are going to be on this list, and of course this is based off of my own personal experiences. But before we begin, I would love to know, what's an underrated first-person shooter in your opinion? If it's not on the list, you'll get a heart from me, a little. I genuinely would love to know. I love first-person shooters, and finding new FPS games, it's always going to be a fun time. And so as always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Thank you all so very much. Hope you enjoy the video. Let's get to the first game. And so kicking things off, we have an FPS that'll never get enough love, and that is Singularity, releasing initially in 2010. This was actually developed by Raven Software. Yes, the same Raven Software that made plenty of other incredible shooters like the Soldier of Fortune games, Hexen, Heretic, and even the Star Wars Jedi Knight titles. This was actually their last title before they would get saddled with Call of Duty. And at the very least, they didn't go out with a whimper. Singularity is actually pretty solid. While it's not the longest shooter on this list, taking only around 4 to 5 hours, it was actually pretty unique for the time and tried to attempt something different. It's all about time travel, and it sees your main character phasing between 1955 and present day, and he does something in the past that very much affects the present, and so it's up to him to go back and rectify his mistakes. But the time traveling elements actually go beyond the story. There's a gameplay element to it as well. You can affect things in the past, which will very much affect things in the present, and I feel like the game does a pretty decent job at taking advantage of this. Not only do you solve a few puzzles with this, but this can also be used in combat as well, and the combat's actually pretty solid in this game. While there isn't a ton of weapons to choose from, they all feel nice, and the enemy AI isn't all that bad. The game has a number of interesting set pieces and moments through it. The pacing is actually pretty solid, even if it does feel a little COD-like when it comes to that, and overall it was a surprisingly memorable experience. Sure, it doesn't look all that special. There are tons of games from the late 2000s and early 2010s that look like this, but Singularity is one that is stuck in my mind way longer than plenty of other games from this era. While the game isn't anything remarkable, it does a good job at carving out its own identity and being something unique. And that's not something I can say about every FPS, especially from the early 2010s. It's dirt cheap nowadays, and if you haven't tried it, it might be the fun little shooter romp that you're looking for. At the very least, the time manipulation is pretty cool. And so here we have a longtime favorite of mine with PAINKILLER. Now this one came out in the mid-2000s and was developed by People Can Fly, the people who would go on to make Bulletstorm and plenty of other great games. But this original PAINKILLER, oh, it's always been such a great time. I've been playing this game for like 15 plus years now, and I've always thought it was a bit underrated, especially nowadays. This game might have come out years after that initial boomer shooter era ended, but it very much feels like a game from that era where they just give you a ton of different weapons to use and tell you to just blast everything in sight, and that is exactly what you do in this game, and it's so good. There's actually a story to this one, and there's more to it than you would think. It's about this dead man named Daniel who's stuck in purgatory when he's offered a deal to defeat the invading forces of Lucifer's army in exchange for being allowed to enter heaven. So yeah, it's up to him to go stop this army single-handedly. The story is just kind of whatever. You're here to just blast everything in sight, and man, it feels so good. You get a number of different weapons to this game, and what's really cool is they all have an alternate fire. For instance, your awesome double-barrel shotgun can also freeze enemies, or the stake gun can also shoot grenades. Your minigun also functions as a rocket launcher. All of the weapons feel very unique, and what's great is they're all very viable. They're all useful, they all can get the job done, and they all just feel so nice to use. All these years later, the weapons have a real kick to them. I love how the shotgun flies back when you shoot from it. I love how the minigun rattles, and I love how the painkiller weapon just gets stuck on shit when it's spinning. Yeah, this game does actually have some physics, and it can go pretty wild. This game at times can get pretty wild when they just bombard you with enemies. They're just coming from all directions, and these environments aren't super big like, say, Serious Sam, and it can feel rather claustrophobic at times, but this is when the game's at its best, where the game just starts to get balls to the walls crazy. Yeah, that's when it's at its peak. And even though every level is super linear and consists of you just shooting at everything that moves, the game actually has a surprisingly good pace to it. It has a lot of variety in its environments, and there's actually a pretty good enemy roster here. There's also some boss fights, and I've always thought the boss fights were just an absolute spectacle here. This giant creature towering over you and you're just shooting at it, sending it everything you got. Yeah, it's pretty entertaining. I thought for the time the game looked pretty nice. There's a pretty great expansion to it that adds even more, and yeah, then there's the rest of the series. It seems like the rest of the series just got worse and worse as the years went on, but there's a reboot coming sometime in the future. Maybe they'll actually be able to live up to this original game. Regardless of all that, OG Painkiller's always going to be a favorite of mine. So our next game is Necromunda Hired Gun. This takes place in the Warhammer 40k universe, and I feel like it's one of the least talked about Warhammer games of the last few years. And maybe it's because Warhammer is primarily a strategy series, or this game just wasn't all that popular. Either way, I think this is a good game. It's not totally tubular, but I still think it's a fun little shooter that has plenty of great moments. You actually get to customize your hired gun, your main character, and you get to take on some bounties in the world of Necromunda, this really shitty, gang-ridden, mechanized planet. The story's just kinda there. At least from a visual standpoint, I think this game is excellent. You wouldn't even know that this is a AA game. It looks really good and the environments have a lot of detail. You can certainly see that it's a AA game though the moment you start playing it. This is a bit of a janky game. It doesn't really matter what you're doing in this game, there's just going to be a certain level of clunkiness to it. Most of the weapons actually feel pretty decent in this game, but it doesn't flow or feel as smooth as most AAA shooters. And when it comes to the feedback or kick you get from these weapons, it's really just not there. And then when you do these melee executions, yeah, it just looks real janky. The animations sometimes feel just kind of choppy, and the whole game lacks a certain level of polish. However, despite all of that, I still think you have a pretty entertaining first-person shooter here. The game absolutely does have its moments. While the shooting isn't incredible, it still is pretty decent. You actually do get an animal to join you, and that's pretty cool and adds another layer. The enemy AI, well, that's just not very good, but at least killing them is somewhat satisfying, and I actually think the level design in this game is quite decent. It's a rather linear experience, but there are little nooks and crannies hidden all over the place with some extra goodies. There's even some side quests that show up in here as well. You do actually have a decent amount of movement options. You can run on walls, dash, slide, you even get a grappling hook. I've heard people call this the Eurojank Doom Eternal, and you know, that's not too far from the truth. While the game is not as fast-paced as Doom Eternal, it still has a rather fast pace to it, and the pacing is actually good in this game. There's plenty of moments and set pieces in there, and there's a whole lot of boss fights. If you're somebody that even kind of likes Warhammer, you're probably going to enjoy this game. I can see some people not enjoying it because it's not the most refined or polished, but I think it's pretty easy to look past that and see the game's finer qualities. It's no Bolt Gun, or Space Marine 2, but it still is fun. So here's a game that I've been talking about quite a lot of as of late, and that is Roboquest. Now, Roboquest came out a few years ago, and while there were some small rumblings about it, I really didn't hear all that much about it. But after giving it a go for myself, I was pleasantly surprised with Roboquest and just how good the game actually is. It's a roguelike FPS, which is pretty rare, but to be completely honest, I can't imagine a roguelike FPS being any better than Roboquest. It absolutely runs with the roguelike side of things, where every run is going to be rather different from the last. The level design is going to be a little different, some of the enemies that show up are going to be different, but what's the most different between all of your runs is the perks you'll get and the weapons. And let me just say, the weapons of Roboquest actually feel very nice. Not only is there a ton of weapons, but they all have a great feel to them, they all have a lot of feedback and kick to them, and I love the little visual indicators that you're shooting from them. Like, the shooting is arguably the best part of this entire game, and as you play more and more of it, it becomes more fast-paced. Eventually you're going to just be flying around all over the place, because if you're standing still, you're going to get absolutely shreked. Like, this is also a difficult game. Of course, there's going to be that random element to it since it is a roguelike, but there's an overlying level of difficulty that is not messing around. But for one reason or another, I just kept coming back to this one. One more run, this will be the run, this will be the time I beat it. Usually I die. But damn it, the combat loop, it's just really solid in this game. I also like the presentation. It's very easy on the eyes. It's got a good little aesthetic to it. It's not going to wow you by any means, but I think it looks alright. And the music, oh, the music is so good in Roboquest. And it does adapt a little bit to what you're doing. As the fight picks up, the music gets crazier and louder, and yeah, it's actually pretty nice. This game in general is rather nice. There's a surprising amount of replayability. There's co-op as well. and it's quickly become one of my favorite roguelikes of the last few years. If you're somebody that likes shooters and are looking for something a little different, this might be the one for you. So here we have the more obscure Darkest of Days. Now this game, it's more of a guilty pleasure for me than anything else. Like, the game does have a number of issues to it, and it would be hard to recommend this one, but there's just something about this game that I kind of like. I think it's just the bizarre premise that has stuck with me all these years. So the game begins during the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was Custer's last stand, all the way back in 1876. Custer gets killed, and your character's about to be killed as well, but he's transported to the future, where he's told that he's going to be time traveling to a bunch of different eras to ensure that the time stream is not altered. People are going around and messing with history, and yeah, you're gonna have to try to stop that. The story is just absolutely absurd, and the game tries to take itself so seriously, but the plot is just so comically stupid. You basically end up traveling to a bunch of different eras, looking for people who shouldn't be there and taking them out. At first, you'll usually go in undercover, so you'll be wearing the correct attire and you'll be using weapons from that era. For instance, you go to the American Civil War and you get to use some genuine musket rifles where you can't hit shit and it takes forever to reload, but eventually in pretty much every level they just say screw it and they give you some futuristic weapons that can just mow people down. And this is when the game is not only at its stupidest but at its best. There is just something so funny about going to these historic battles like the American Indian Wars or the Civil War or even World War I with just these homing fully automatic assault rifles and just destroying everyone in sight. It's ridiculous, it's stupid, and it's low-key nonsensical, but it is entertaining as hell. I will put up with all of this game's issues like the pacing, the weapons and how they feel, the general level design, the story, and rather lackluster presentation for these moments. These moments make the entire game. If these weren't here, this wouldn't be a very good game at all, and I wouldn't be here talking about it, but the game really makes the most of these moments to the point where all these years later, I can still vividly recall Darkest of Days and just how I felt while I was playing it. I knew it was dumb as shit, but I also found it to be rather enjoyable, which is kind of what's important when it comes to video games, you would think. So yeah, Darkest of Days, it's got a whole host of problems. Too many to list out in a video like this, and I could see why somebody wouldn't enjoy the game. But it does have a few parts to it where I think the game actually does become good, to the point where I would say it's an underrated FPS. It's not the most widely available, but if you ever see it for the real cheap, it might be worth checking out. You'll get a few laughs, that's for sure. And so here we have the Robocop game from a few years ago. I've spoken on this game a few times at this point, and you might go, that's not really underrated now. I think the game is still underrated. I think it's still shocking just how good this game actually is. You would not expect a Robocop game in the modern day to be this good, yet here we are. The game takes place after the movies, and it's about Robocop cleaning up some crime in Rogue City. That's really all there is to the story. It's pretty basic stuff. You're here because you want to destroy everything in sight, and this game does a great job. The weapons are so good in this game. They really just nailed the feel for a lot of these guns. Like, Robocop's pistol feels incredible. There's an amazing amount of kick to it, and it just feels really visceral. But I could also say the same about like all of the other weapons. The submachine gun, the shotgun, really every gun just has this raw sensation when you're using them. And one of the reasons is because people get just absolutely torn to shreds here. You annihilate people. You don't just gun them down. You are blowing body parts off. You are just turning them into mincemeat, and damn, it feels so good. The game is set in these open areas, not an open world, that are mostly linear, but there are plenty of side missions you get to do, and they're actually worth doing in this game. They're fun, and the main reason they're fun is because the gunplay is as good as it is. You even get to make some choices throughout the game that can affect things like the ending, and yeah, all of this was just way higher quality than anyone would expect. There's a ton of fan service for Robocop. It looks great, especially for being a AA game. And it's clear to me that Teon, the developers, really just understood the assignment. And that's why I'm really excited that this is getting a standalone expansion soon. But in the meantime, oh, you gotta try Rogue City. The game is actually really good. So here we have Call of Juarez Gunslinger. Now, I struggled to call this one underrated. I've had so many people tell me just how good this game is, and the game hasn't fallen into obscurity, but I still think it's worth bringing this game up because Call of Juarez Gunslinger is actually a really great game. Now, the Call of Juarez series itself has been rather up and down, but I think we can all agree that Gunslinger is like the best game of the whole franchise. It really is like the ideal spaghetti western game. It has some really unique storytelling, where it sees our main character going over some of his past adventures, and as he's telling the stories, people will call him out that he's exaggerating and things will just change on the fly, kinda like Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, only like 10 years earlier. And the voice acting is quite good, and all of this adds to just a really unique atmosphere and vibe. And then yeah, it's a spaghetti western. That's pretty rare for video games at this point, but this game absolutely thrives with it. You get all the weapons from that era and they all feel very nice. They all sound nice, and every weapon just has this oomph to them that I can't get enough of. The game also goes for this really arcade vibe, where you get points for killing people and you want to try to kill as many people in succession and as fast as you can to get as many points as possible. And it'll lead you to replaying some of these areas to try to get more points and try to look as cool as possible. I played through this game a few times because the gameplay is not only incredibly intuitive, but it's just fun. It's not the longest game at only around 4 or 5 hours, but the pacing is really great. All of the levels are different from each other, and they really play to the strengths of the Wild West. There's plenty of set pieces sprinkled throughout this game. You know I love my set pieces. Well, there's plenty here to keep things interesting, engaging, and it's genuinely some of the most fun I've had from any FPS from the 2010s. The game has a really nice look to it. There's a fair amount of replayability to this one. I think most people that play this usually end up coming back to it at some point. There's just something about this game that really hits different, and if you've played it before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's also the duels, which are, I mean, they're okay, but that's not really why you're here. You're here to kill everything in sight as fast as possible with some yeehaw looking guns, and you're gonna have a damn good time doing it. The game actually has been re-released since it is a bit of a cult classic, and so you got no excuse. Check this one out. So from maybe the most well-known game on the list to the most obscure game of this entire list, here we have REDNECK. Now Redneck Rampage came out in the late 90s and actually runs on the same engine as Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior, but you don't hear anybody hype this game up like those games. And that's mostly because, quite frankly, this game is nowhere near as good as either of those games, but what you have here is still a decent little shooter from the era that manages to have a lot of personality. When it comes to the game's format, it very much is structured like the other build engine games, where you're dropped into these relatively large open areas and you're told to find keys in order to progress, and there's actually a fair amount of interactivity here. You can even destroy some things in the environment, which is pretty cool. It's nowhere near as interactive as, say, Duke Nukem 3D, but it's nice that it's there. And the way you finish the level is pretty goofy, where you just hit your best bud with a crowbar. The story and setting is, well, look at the title of the game. It's what you would expect. It's about as redneck as it gets when it comes to the music, the aesthetic, the vibes, the weapons. It's all very farmer based, and you know, I wouldn't want it any other way. And all these years later, there's really never been a redneck game to hit like REDNECK did. And there's even a few expansions for this game which further just elevate the vibes and add even more levels. And so you might be wondering, why isn't this game as revered as its fellow build engine games like Blood? There are a few issues with it. First off, the hit detection with the weapons just isn't that great. A lot of the times you will just shoot stuff and you will completely miss. I don't know if they were trying to emulate that you're just totally drunk and missing things, but a lot of these weapons miss all the damn time and it gets so annoying. At least the bigger late game weapons don't miss very much, but those starting weapons, yeah, they miss a lot. Personality or not, the shooting can get a bit frustrating at times. The other thing is some of these levels are just way too big and open, and it's a little cryptic on where you're supposed to go next. I've gotten lost in more levels of REDNECK than Blood, Shadow Warrior, and Duke Nukem combined. So a walkthrough is probably needed. Despite all that though, the game has a lot of charm, personality, there is still plenty of enjoyable moments and entertainment to be found with this, and if you like games from this era, this definitely should be one you check out. It certainly has flaws, but it's got a lot of highs as well. So here's one that could always use a bit more love, with The Darkness 2 releasing in the early 2010s. The Darkness 2 really looks on that original game and improves it in several key areas. You don't need to have played the first one either, just know that you play as Jackie, the head of a mob, who simply put has darkness coming out of him through these tentacle monsters, and it sees you taking on a number of people that have wronged you. The story is actually pretty great in this game, the voice acting is solid, and I found the whole thing to be quite entertaining, outside of the disappointing ending. But when it comes to the gameplay, that's where this game really excels, since, you know, you have to stay in the dark, you do have to shoot lights out, which is pretty unique for a non-stealth game, but what makes the gameplay even more unique is all of the abilities you have. Jackie himself can use a number of firearms, and the shooting is pretty alright in this game. Some of the weapons feel nice, and it can get a bit gory, but where things really get kicked up is when the monster gets involved. When the darkness shows up, then you can just start shredding people to pieces, like actually just ripping them in half, tearing them up, eating them, and all sorts of gory moves. This is a violent game. It's very gory, and the way that you destroy people still feels unlike any other game, even compared to the Darkness 1, but I think the combat is actually quite good here. I think all of this gives it its own unique identity and feel that really no other FPS game has tried to replicate since. And while the game is super linear, it's constantly keeping things interesting with new set pieces, environments, and story beats to keep you engaged the entire time. It's not the longest experience, you can beat it in like 4 to 6 hours, but it is an entertaining one. I also really like the game's presentation. It goes for like a cel-shaded art style to fit the comic book series that the Darkness is actually based off of. There was also a tacked on multiplayer mode for this game, but I don't even think anybody was playing it back in the day, let alone nowadays. It's a real shame we never got a third game. I think pretty much everybody would be happy if we got a Darkness 3, but here we are 10 plus years later, and it's not looking like it's gonna happen. But hey, at least we got the Darkness 2. Pretty good first-person shooter that's unfortunately a bit forgotten now. So here we have a game that I've actually never talked about once on the channel, and that is Hard Reset, initially releasing in 2011. This game was developed by Flying Wild Hog, the people that made the Shadow Warrior reboot trilogy. At release, it got a pretty mixed reception and kind of just fell into obscurity like immediately. The game takes place in a cyberpunk world and features a number of cyberpunk tropes. The story, yeah, it's just kind of whatever. When it comes to the gameplay, it's actually more reminiscent of Painkiller than anything else, where you're dropped into these very linear levels where you really just move forward and shoot at everything that moves. Something that sets Hard Reset apart from other shooters is that you actually only get 2 weapons in the game, an assault rifle and a plasma rifle, but these can be heavily customized with different firing modes, and so you aren't just shooting the same 2 weapons the entire game. And thankfully, the remastered version that came out a few years later actually does add more weapons, enemies, and a bit more variety in general. The levels really are nothing special in this game, but the combat can get pretty enjoyable. You can get a few hours of fun blasting everything inside in this game, and a few hours is really all you're gonna have with this one. I remember it was incredibly short originally. The remaster version adds a bit more, but you won't have more than like 5 hours with this one. At the very least, it is a great looking game. This game is punching well above its weight since it is basically a AA game with excellent lighting, environments, animation, etc. And I also really enjoy the game's dark, gritty cyberpunk aesthetic. Look, it's not Cyberpunk 2077, but not every game has to be like that has a cyberpunk vibe. Overall, Hard Reset is a fun little throwback shooter you can get a few hours of fun from when you need a quick game to break up the monotony of all these other giant games. While it doesn't try to reinvent the wheel whatsoever, it still is entertaining. So here's a really underrated one. We have Urban Chaos Riot Response. So this game was developed by Rocksteady Studios of Batman Arkham fame, and it's the only game they've ever made that isn't based on a DC property, and it's actually pretty good. The game's premise is pretty simple. It's about you just trying to save people. You're part of a riot control squad in a city that has been basically completely overrun by gangs, and you're just trying to save the innocent. There's a little bit more nuance to the story, and the game's presentation is quite good, but it's not all that complex, and it really doesn't need to be either. And when it comes to the gameplay, it's all about you wiping out those gangs and trying to save people. You actually get a pretty wide arsenal of weapons and riot gear to use. I feel like it's pretty rare when you actually get to use like police weapons, and especially a riot shield in a single player game. I can only really think of COD.
I'm a pussy that use riot shield.
But yeah, the riot shield is no joke in this game. It's actually pretty good. What's really cool is you can upgrade all of these weapons and they just get better and better. I'd argue there's no bad weapon here. The shooting is very good for the era. It's incredibly responsive, smooth, and the weapons feel nice. A lot of these console-only first-person shooters that came out in the mid-2000s are a little difficult to play nowadays, but not Urban Chaos Riot Response. This game slaps when it comes to the combat. Of course, though, you also get to save people. That's pretty cool as well. There's even some on-rail sections where you get to destroy stuff with a minigun. The pacing is pretty strong with this one. They're able to keep things entertaining the entire time, and it's not going to take you more than half a dozen hours to beat, but it sure is going to be a memorable one. The game looks nice, especially for being a late PS2 game, and it makes you wonder why this game didn't really take off. I think it just looks a little too generic, and to a certain extent it is, but I don't really care that it's generic. It's a good game. And nowadays, I think my biggest issue with the game is that it's not widely available. It was never released on PC, it's gotten no re-release at all. It's totally just fallen off the face of the earth, and that's a damn shame. So here I am to hype this up and just say this game is genuinely one of the best first-person shooters for the PS2, and you've probably never even heard of it. Total hidden gem and very much worth playing in my opinion. So here we got another game I've never talked about on the channel once, and that is Heavy Bullets. So there's like underrated first-person shooters, obscure first-person shooters, and then there's just games that I don't think like anybody outside of me and a few dozen people know of, and that is Heavy Bullets. So Heavy Bullets came out in the mid-2010s exclusively for PC and is a really strange roguelike FPS. Yeah, Roboquest isn't the only roguelike FPS we're talking about today. I totally forgot about Heavy Bullets. I remember seeing this one because it was published by Devolver Digital and I thought it looked interesting and spent a few hours with it. And looking back, while it didn't blow me away, I still thought it was a unique, fun little game. So the big gimmick of this one is that in this game you only have one weapon, this revolver, and every bullet you shoot you have to actually go get it back. And then it sees you going through a number of randomly generated floors with some random elements thrown in there, and hopefully eventually you beat it. There's a few bosses and plenty of things that want to stop you. So like 20 seconds ago I mentioned that you have to go get your bullets back whenever you shoot them. This might sound quite annoying, but it's actually quite easy since you're never in environments that are all that big, and you can still shoot like 6 bullets until you have to start to go get them back. And there's plenty of things that show up allowing you to get extra bullets as well. And hey, even though you just have one weapon in this game, it does actually feel pretty nice, and usually you gotta look for a weak spot with these enemies. There's actually a little bit of strategy with this one, and it is on the slower pace. There's a bunch of traps that want to stop you as well, and I believe that all of the random elements keeps things interesting. The game does have a pretty unique aesthetic and art style to it. It's obviously very simple and basic, but I like the colors, and the game has some nice sound effects to it as well. Look, this game isn't going to reel you in the same way that Roboquest will, but I think the core gameplay loop is good enough that you're going to want to do a few runs of this game at least. I feel like this game is about as underground as it gets, and I think it deserves a little bit more attention. It tried to do something different, and it does manage to create something a little unique. I'm sure at this point the game is dirt cheap when it comes to Steam sales. It's only on PC, and hey, you could do a lot, like genuinely a lot worse than this. So here's another underrated, forgotten shooter from the late 2000s, and that is Necrovision. So this game was developed by The Farm 51, who are actually still around. They're developing Chernobyl Light 2, and even made a remake of the original Painkiller that we're not going to talk about. Today we're talking about Necrovision. So this is an alternate history World War I title that sees you as an American soldier just fighting the Germans when all of a sudden vampires, demons, and zombies show up. And so yeah, you're going to be fighting a lot more than just the Germans. The story and world is actually somewhat interesting. There's really not that many World War I games even nowadays, and then this game is a fun spin on it with all of these monsters showing up. When it comes to the actual moment-to-moment gameplay though, it gets pretty wild. While it starts out simple enough and you're using, you know, World War I weapons and fighting soldiers and zombies, it all starts to get pretty crazy, especially by the end of it. They pretty much completely abandon anything to do with World War I, and you're using just supernatural weapons. You can hold a melee weapon and a firearm at the same time, and you absolutely just tear shit up in this game. You do regenerate health, so it's not a totally old school experience, but you're pretty much shooting everything in sight, and the weapons actually feel pretty decent in this game. It does feel a bit clunky and janky, especially the melee weapons, or really just melee attacks in general, but I thought this was actually pretty fun, and I found the combat to be responsive enough. On top of this, there actually is a combo system, but this is pretty basic and feels just kind of thrown in there. Something else that mixes the gameplay up is there's actually a few vehicle segments, like this one part where you're in this giant mech basically just destroying everything in sight, and at one point you even get to ride a dragon. The game is certainly memorable, I can give it that. Something else I remember about this game is that it's pretty ugly. Like, even for the late 2000s, this is not a great looking game, but hey, at least it's got its own aesthetic and art style. I also remember the music being pretty ridiculous in this game, with the final boss theme in particular being just something else entirely. I don't want to spoil it, but it's a bit silly. This game in general seems a little silly, kind of like Darkest of Days, but this game's a lot better than Darkest of Days. It's actually a very competent, good first-person shooter that I can recommend even nowadays, especially if you're looking for something different. There was even a prequel released for it, but I actually have never really tried the prequel, so I can't really speak on that. But either way, Necrovision, oh, it's something different, that's for sure. So here's another more recent last-minute addition to this list, and that is Turbo Overkill. I've spoken on this one a few times, I'll speak on it again. Turbo Overkill might be like the fastest first-person shooter of them all, but I also think that it's an excellent FPS that just hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. It's gotten some attention, don't get it twisted, but it deserves a lot more than this. This is genuinely one of the best boomer shooters of them all. It takes place in a cyberpunk world, and it sees you playing as essentially a mercenary with a chainsaw chainsaw for a leg. And you even get this neat little robot companion. I love this game's vibes and aesthetics. It looks nice, but when it comes to actually playing the game, oh, it's crazy. This game is just so fast. You are blisteringly fast. You are running all over the place, dashing, sliding, wall running, and even more as you get through the game. The game just continuously raises stakes. At first, you're just kind of sliding around, destroying stuff with the chainsaw. Eventually, you get in the car and you're starting to blow stuff up, and it's just like Descent, and it really just only gets crazier from here. This game is a great arsenal when it comes to its weapons. It's actually got a good amount. They've all got alternate firing modes. They're all very different from each other, and the most important thing, they're all satisfying as hell to use. They have a ton of feedback, they're responsive, it's smooth, it's just really well done. These are genuinely some of the best weapons I've used in any modern boomer shooter, and sliding around with the chainsaw really just never gets old. Like, it never gets old. It's so much fun. And then there's also a ton of enemies. Like, some areas are just flooded with enemies, so many to annihilate, and there's actually a good enemy roster here also. And then if that wasn't enough, the level design is low-key peak when it comes to a modern boomer shooter. All of these levels are incredibly varied. They're different from each other. There's tons of awesome moments and set pieces. Every single level has something awesome to it and feels different from the last. Like, genuinely, I was just having such a fun time with this one. And then, probably unsurprisingly, the music slaps in this game also. A few weeks ago, I did a video on FPS games I would give a 10 out of 10, my highest recommendation. I wish I included Turbo Overkill. The game is actually that good. Like, it is one of the very best shooters of the last few years. Check it out immediately. But sadly, we are at the last game for today, but at least we're going to end on a banger and something different. I'm actually going to talk about a multiplayer FPS game. I know all of the games I've talked about today are single player games, but no, we're going to talk about a multiplayer one, and that is Rising Storm 2 Vietnam. Now, there's not a lot of multiplayer FPS games that I've gotten into over the last, I don't know, decade or so, but this is actually one of the ones I put a good amount of time into. It was developed by Tripwire, the people who made Killing Floor and Red Orchestra, and really it is a follow-up to Red Orchestra 2, taking place during the Vietnam War, and it's a really serious first-person shooter, and it's actually good. The game is a minimalist hub. You die in pretty much one shot, and it's all about knowing these maps and being able to spot people. It's pretty hardcore, but even all these years later, there still isn't many games like it, and I've actually come back to this one throughout the years, and not only am I surprised that there's still a ton of people playing this game even now in 2025, but how much fun it is every single time. Just getting together with my buddies and trying to take over a hill or fight off the Viet Cong is always going to be something special in this game. The weapons are, again, very realistic. They handle realistically. There's basically no HUD in this game, and it has a pretty big learning curve, but despite all that, damn, it really is a good time. And it's the only multiplayer FPS game I'm recommending today. It doesn't matter if it's 2018, 2020, 2025, 2030, there's always going to be somebody playing this one, and it's not just the sweaties and hardcores. You can still get into it and have a lot of fun. I'm dog shit at this game, and even I was getting a bunch of kills and winning games. But anyway, we could be here a bit longer talking about Rising Storm 2, but I want to wrap this video up. I'm getting pretty hungry thinking about them spicy nuggets, so that's going to be the code word for today. Spicy nuggets. Yep, we're doing it again. I really should probably stop eating Wendy's, but it's not going to stop, so I'll see you all later. Peace.